Hello, friends. Today we're going to be looking at the common thread for this week's devotional passages. And so as you're reading through these lectionary readings, the thing that really stood out to me was just how powerful God is. Now, each of these passages highlights this kind of idea of the greatness, the power, the grandeur of God. So, for example, you have the Psalm, which is just about the mighty God and his power and how the tempest rolls around him and fire consumes before him. This image of power, of authority, of judgment, of just honestly control over the terrifying elements of nature. You see a similar thing in the First Kings passage where Elijah is taken up before Elisha. Elijah is taken up in this whirlwind of fire with this chariots and horses. And it's obviously pretty terrifying as Elisha calls out, my father, the horses and the chariots of Israel. It's just this wild, sort of powerful, dynamic encounter with the power of God. The Transfiguration story from Mark, you have the same kind of vibe where for a moment, the disciples are able to see the true greatness, the true power and divinity of Jesus, and they're a little bit flabbergasted by what they see. It says that Peter was so frightened he didn't know what to say, so he just starts, running his mouth because he's just awestruck by what he sees, because Jesus becomes a sort of radiant figure, and they see him in all of his glory. Similarly, Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians, that the full glory of God is visible in the face of Jesus Christ. And this is such that it compels him to say, Jesus is Lord, and I am a servant for his sake. So in each of these cases, the power of God is manifest. But what's really interesting is in each of these cases, not only is the power of God manifest, but the nearness of God, the closeness, the care of God is manifest. In this Second Kings passage, you have, on the one hand, the power of taking Elijah up in this dramatic way. But on the other hand, prophet after prophet tells Elisha, your master's being taken away today. God gave this message to each of them so that they could share with Elisha and prepare him for this painful and challenging experience. And at the same time, he asks for this blessing from Elijah. He says, Elijah, I want to receive a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says, well, you've asked a hard thing, but if you can see me taken up, it will be given to you. And God grants him that grace, that favor of giving him this request that he asked for. In the Psalms, we see the power of God is manifest as this whirling tempest or this rolling fire. And yet, the psalmist puts his hope in this God. He sees this God as standing for Israel. In the Transfiguration, the disciples witness this moment, and they're terrified. They don't know what to do. And then the voice of God speaks clearly to them and says, this is my son. I love him. Listen to him. So God, his greatness is manifest, and yet he uses that opportunity to speak a message specifically to these men, these ordinary people who are following after God. And he recognizes their devotion, and he speaks to them. And so too, in 2 Corinthians, this is really Paul's underlying point, that he sees the glory, the greatness of God, and it compels him to follow. That this glory is not manifest to crush humanity, to stymie us, to make us feel frustrated or confused, to overwhelm us. It's meant to allure us, to beckon us closer and say, I am great, but I love you. You're my children. Come to me. And so Paul responds in love, in compassion. He says, I am the servant. Jesus is the Lord. I am the servant. And he's writing this to the Corinthians, and really his whole point of this passage is he says, I'm nothing, and yet here I am doing what God wants me to do. And it is a powerful, meaningful work. The parts that follow that passage that we read in 2 Corinthians, he goes on to say, we have a treasure but we're holding it in cracked clay jars. We don't deserve to hold the treasure, but we get to anyway. God is treating us with love and compassion. He's looking with favor on us. And so you have this tension between these two realities. One, the greatness of God, the power of God, the grandeur and the majesty that is so overwhelming, so far above us. On the other hand, this care, this compassion, that God is so close to us. And so, friends, as you are reading the Bible, as you're going through this coming week, I hope that you know both of these realities. One, that God is great, that he is worthy to be praised, to be adored, that he is worthy for you to sacrifice greatly. And yet, he knows you. He loves you. He cares about you. And he wants you to follow him, to learn from him, to find joy and peace and rest in his presence. So it's my prayer that you will find that in the presence of God. Go in peace.